Well, it is 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get started right on time tonight because I know we've planned this meeting for an hour, and this meeting is being recorded. So those people who could not join us tonight will be able to come back and watch this at a later time. I'm Tony Jones, the school superintendent, and I welcome our PCG group tonight. Just a little bit about the overview. Our special education review is something that the Board of Education was requesting in our school budget. Also, the BET was very supportive, who was the finance board for the town, was very supportive of conducting this work just to look at what we're doing really well, where we can find efficiencies and work differently. And so we're really excited about this study and think we're going to learn a lot about our system. The process itself, we did post a request for proposals with an RFP that the board worked on at one of their board meetings to say, what is it that we want the study to be about? We posted that publicly. We had, I believe it was 12 responders. So we went through a review of those proposals. And then from those proposals, we narrowed down to 3 finalists. And I was the person who actually helped coordinate, but the real strength was in our 2 board members, Karen Kowalski and Karen Hirsch, who are part of the steering committee. Caroline Liram was also part of the steering committee, and PTA will have 1 more person joining the steering committee between now and the end of the year. I think they were just looking at who that person is going to be, and so probably by the end of this week, we'll know who that is. But I welcome you tonight to the Public Consulting Group, and this is really your meeting, so I don't want to take any more of your time, and I'll turn it over to Matt if you want to introduce your team, and we'll let you get started.
Certainly, Tony. Thank you so much. Can participants see the slides that will be corresponding with our presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we're so pleased to be here this evening to really walk through the comprehensive special education program review in a way that breaks it down and really allows you to fully understand what it is we'll be doing, how we'll be doing it, and the timeline that we'll be doing it in. So this is our kickoff meeting. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. In terms of where we'll be headed this evening, our agenda will be introducing the core team who you see on the screen. We're going to talk about PCG, Public Consulting Group, and really the PCG difference as it relates to how we do our work. We're going to talk about the approach as it relates to this project, and we're going to go through some FAQs as well as questions that were pre-submitted. Next slide, please. Now we'll introduce ourselves, the core team. Next slide. So I'm Matthew Korobkin. I am the project director for this review. My background, I come by way of having been a special education teacher. I worked for 2 state education agencies. Most recently, I was with the Delaware Department of Education, where I was a special assistant to the Secretary of Education as it related to special education and evaluation. My role in this work will really be around project oversight, facilitation, stakeholder outreach, as well as subject matter expertise. Next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jennifer. Jennifer, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, thank you. I was double muted. So good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Meller. I have been with PCG for about 9 years now, serving as a subject matter expert in special education and leading these reviews nationally, overseeing our work both at the district and at the state level in terms of the evaluations and reviews that we do. I, like Matt, came from a practitioner background and spent about 10 years working in urban education, focused on special education, and spent quite a few years in finance as well. So always look to that background and my experience as being in the field as something that's very informative to the way that we manage these projects. Like Matt, I will be working on the stakeholder outreach piece of this work. So you will see our faces many times on focus groups and other outreach that we do, and helping to facilitate those conversations. And we're just so excited to be a part of this.
Next slide. Anna, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Matt. So I am Anna, and I am based out of the New York City office. And prior to being a senior advisor at PCG, I was a former associate at the New York State Education Department, primarily overseeing special education regulatory compliance for charter schools throughout New York City. And prior to that, I was a New York City public school teacher, special education for several years in the South Bronx.
Thank you, Anna. And Matthew.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Scott, and I am based out of our Denver office alongside Jennifer Meller's team in supporting these types of projects and reviews. My background is in education. I have about 10 years of experience within education management, serving in a variety of capacities, including overseeing institutional effectiveness. Specifically as it relates to this project, I bring project coordination, data analysis, along with our stakeholder engagement. Happy to be here this evening.
Thank you, Matthew. Next slide, please. And two folks who aren't on the call, but nevertheless will be playing a very important role in this work. Dr. Jerry Petroff, who will be serving as a project advisor. He's a professor and he's the executive director at the Center for Sensory and Complex Needs at the College of New Jersey. He also is a former administrator with the New Jersey Department of Education. And he'll be supporting our classroom observation piece. His name may be familiar to you if you were special education college students. He wrote many a textbook, including one very well known on assistive technology matters. We're very lucky and fortunate to have him on our team, as well as Sue Gam, who will also serve as a project advisor. She is the former Chief Specialized Services Officer for Chicago Public Schools, a former District Director with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, and also a teacher at the start of her career. She brings law as well as special education leadership to the table, and she'll be advising us on legal, procedural, and policy matters as it relates to this review. Next slide, please. A little bit about us, PCG. So we've been around since 1986. We're headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, but we're all over the country. You may hear the accent every now and then. I come from Massachusetts, I come from New England, but I'm actually based out of the Princeton office. The work and world we're in is leading public sector management, consulting, and operations improvements in the areas of health, education, and human services, really delivering solutions that matter. We have 3,000 staff across 55 offices, both in the United States as well as internationally, and we have a presence locally, both in Windsor, Connecticut, as well as Lower Manhattan, an office that I'm also I spend time in. We are accustomed to high-profile, high-impact projects where we're working shoulder to shoulder with the leadership and with the stakeholders to make positive change. Next slide, please. Some regional success stories of note. In terms of Connecticut, you may have heard our name before. As it relates to ReadCon, we worked with the Connecticut Department of Education on that initiative, which was a rigorous, engaging professional learning program for Connecticut teachers, special education teachers, and school-based literacy leaders and administrators. We also worked with the New York State Education Department on Engage New York, a curriculum that was developed by PCG. We partnered with others, but served as a lead. In terms of targeted program reviews of this nature, Chappaqua, this nature being not special education, but I take that back, targeted as in a specific area of the world of work we're in. Chappaqua, we're doing a school counseling review. In New Paltz, we did a school counseling review. And then in terms of the special education work, the work that we're talking about tonight, a whole host of districts, Newark Public Schools in New Jersey, Princeton Public Schools, which we're doing right now. West Windsor Plainsboro Regional School District in New Jersey, a comprehensive review we're doing now. Northern Valley Regional High School District in Bergen County, New Jersey, that's a completed job. Sharon Public Schools in Sharon, Massachusetts, a comprehensive review. And we had the pleasure of working for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, where we worked with the department on monitoring redesign, both in the form of a report as well as recommendations that they leveraged and used as a means to redesign much of their monitoring. Next slide, please. And so program review fundamentals, the way we work, I'll start by saying experience. It's very important. Experience that's focused on student outcomes, special education as in holistically reviewing the program, leadership and development, organizational leadership and redesign, strong local and national policy expertise, and best practice. I think you'll see the folks that are on the line, as well as the folks that are on the project page, demonstrate that. Collaborative partnership. This is a cornerstone of our work. We work with school districts and state education agencies to design customized approaches that meet the needs of the district and provide answers to essential questions, but we're doing it in a collaborative nature. We are working with the district, alongside the district, to make these reviews come to reality. We're not auditors per se, but we are engaged in the review process. Data collection approaches that capture succinct analysis and reporting, and we do it in a variety of different ways. And subsequently in our reports, it shows that in presentable tables that are easy to understand. And transforming that data so that you, the district, can choose which recommendations you want to embark upon, when you want to embark upon them, and how, leveraging data. They're data informed, and you can see the data in a way that's easily digestible. And following fundamental project management adherence and making sure that the scope stays the way we originated it, or if we need to expand, we expand, nevertheless keeping in budget. It's all very important. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Meller.
All right, thanks, Matt. You can go right ahead. We're going to go in depth into the project plan and walk you through how we envision this project from the beginning based on the RFP requirements, and then how we have since tailored even further the kind of work that we're going to do. I want to emphasize up front that this quote or this statement about how we come to this work is very intentional, as we say here. For us, it's not just about identifying the challenges, which we know every school district has. It's a matter of clarifying them and then developing a plan, identifying what path to take. But for us, it's really about seeing that change after. We routinely stay on with districts after the review is completed, because we don't want, as much as you don't want, this report to be something that sits on a shelf. We know that you want to see change that happens from this. And we also know it's not always easy to create that. We bring experience from many different districts in how they can go about doing that, and the project management component of keeping moving on the action plan that we will work jointly with the district to create at the end of this review. We always keep this in mind though, and as I mentioned, I worked in a school district where I went through 3 of these reviews. So this to me is a critical part of making sure we set Greenwich up for success, knowing what it takes to have that detailed to drive this plan forward in the future. Next slide, please. So Matt mentioned a number of these things in terms of how we come to this work. So as we've mentioned, we're collaborative by design. We certainly come with protocols and ideas, but we always want to be working to ensure that how we are going about this project is customized for the district and for your community. We organize our work around essential questions, and we do that because it helps us to very clearly lay out areas of recommendations, areas of our findings, so that we can pinpoint the strengths and then the opportunities for improvement. As you will hear tonight, we call our approach to our reviews multidimensional. And what we mean by that is we are going through many different data sources to be able to feel like our results and our findings are grounded in what our data are telling us objectively, and also in our experience in terms of best practices and where we see gaps on the big picture to be able to help you with your roadmap down the line. And then the last piece is that we are a big part of what we look at is accountability and how it is that the work happens now and who's responsible for it and how decisions are made. But then beyond that, we are looking to help with how these recommendations can be enacted. And that's where the accountability portion comes in. Next slide. As you can see, we are already underway. We are underway with phase one. We got moving quickly on this project after the award. So in October, we've completed phase one. We are moved into phase two. And pretty quickly in the next week or two, moving into phase three with starting our data collection. As you will see, October to December is the core time that we are doing our data collection. We recognize, and we'll talk a little bit further, that this is an unusual school year. And so we will account for that and recognize what that means and document what's happening now in your schools and practices, but also thinking longer term about trends that you have seen over time and marrying those to understand what happens post-pandemic, if I can say that, and how to continue to resolve issues that may have been present in the past, but now are compounded by the impact of COVID. So this is our core time, October to December. We will then spend time in January, bleed into that a little bit to do our classroom observations and begin to crunch all of our data. It will be quite a massive report. I can tell you that now, just based on the information we'll collect. And we are ensuring that we will have the report completed so that decisions can be made starting in June. So that's when we will be delivering the report and starting to work on the action implementation plan. Next slide, please. So we bring to this work, as we said, a strong foundation. So what we have done in phase one already is to do number one. We are bringing you all together virtually, and that we are continuing to refine our work plan. We've got drafts underway and are continuing to evolve the project and the planning. And we're at the point now where we're customizing those tools, those protocols that we're going to be using to meet the unique needs of Greenwich. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are essential questions that we follow, and we do this to organize our report in a way that's readable and accessible for all of you. But it also, we ensure that it lines up to the requirements that were issued in that original RFP, knowing that you have some very specific things you're looking for, and we want to make sure that we respond to those needs. So the first area is around the continuum of services and meeting compliance and data collection requirements. That will be one big area that we'll talk further about. Another one is around funds. How are funds budgeted for special education? What are the major cost drivers? How are resources allocated? And are they allocated in a way that maximizes the return on investment for the district? The next piece is human capital. So extending that resource piece, thinking about how does GPS organize and utilize human capital? So teachers, paraeducators, everyone that supports students with disabilities, we want to take a look at and understand how staffing occurs. And then following that, we will have a significant focus on instructional practices. How is it that GPS is preparing students with disabilities specifically to be ready for post-secondary life? And what does inclusive practices look like? What does it mean to have an inclusive community? And how is that demonstrated in your schools today? And the last piece is about understanding prior to a referral, how are learning needs, behavior needs of students who might be struggling in a general education setting met through a tiered system of support? You'll hear us talk about RTI and or MTSS. That's the concept of having us understand what it is that you're doing on a progressively tiered process to meet student needs, and how are you using data to do that. Next slide, please. So the next few slides break down further these research questions. What you'll see on the left are the questions that the areas of focus that I just talked us through. And what we provided on the right is our understanding of what you asked for in the RFP. We wanted to show, as I said earlier, a clear connection between what it is that we understood as pain points and areas of focus that you've identified, and how we bundle those and then organize our data collection around those to make sure that we're answering the questions. This question, as we said, is about a continuum of services and compliance and data requirements. So that's where we will take a look in more detail at the referral process, how you collect data, identification and prevalence rates of disability by grade. You can see the whole list of things that we will, that this question will address. Next slide. Similarly, with the budget, we understand that you are interested in looking at extended school year costs, costs of settlement agreements and out-of-district placements, both internally and then how you compare to benchmark districts. Anna's going to talk a little bit further about how we'll select those districts, but our idea is that we want to make sure that we're giving you information so that you can see relatively where Greenwich falls in some of these areas related to cost. Next slide. So the last three questions, I know there's a lot on this slide here, but when it comes to staffing, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the number of staff and how they are used in each of the levels in Greenwich schools, and then understanding in depth how you organize your staff to meet the needs of students. How is it that the services that are provided, or listed, I should say, on an IEP are actually delivered in a school building? And who does it and when? That's a core part of understanding the staffing piece. When it comes to instructional practices, this to us is key. This is how you will improve outcomes for students with disabilities, is understanding what access students have to a general education curriculum, and then how are they supported with their specific needs to be successful. So part of that is understanding your systems of support. How are your classes organized? How are teachers receiving professional development related to best instructional practices? What does transition planning look like for students who are ready to graduate? On the other end, how are they prepared and connected to resources in the preschool setting coming into kindergarten? And then finally, out of district programs, we want to understand why is it that parents may opt to pursue an out of district placement? What is it that is needed in GPS schools to better support students within the district? And then we'll look at performance, graduation rates, dropout rates, the achievement rates on assessments. That's one portion of looking at outcomes that we'll be sure to go in depth into. And then lastly, as I've mentioned before, we'll take an in-depth look at the instructional practices in the general education setting. What does tier 1 look like for all students? And then what do tiers 2 and 3 look like when students progressively need more support, either academically or behaviorally? So those are our questions and the areas of focus. I want to say that these RFP requirements or specifications are not all inclusive. We have a detailed list of many, many more subcategories under each of our questions that we'll go into. But we wanted to show here that we have understood what you are seeking, and we'll continue to drill down deeper into all of these specific areas. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who's going to take us even more in depth into our data collection approach.
Thank you, Doctor. So Basically, tied to the research questions, as Dr. Meller was describing, is also our research approach, which we will partner with the district to complete an independent, comprehensive review. And essentially, this research approach is made up of three parts. There is first the current state of analysis, and that's where we'll be reviewing the present quality of the district's special education programs so that we can formulate any recommendations that may be needed for district improvement. Second, there's also an inventory of promising practices where we'll review and gather some of the good things going on in the district in regard to special education practices. And then there's also stakeholder outreach. And this is where we'll be communicating with parents and district staff via interviews and focus groups. And these three parts are really meant to inform and complement one another so that we get a very comprehensive and high-level view of what's really going on in the district. Next slide, please. So on this slide are some of the following ways we'll be collecting data during this review. So regarding interviews and focus groups, that will involve the representation of various stakeholders, parents, special educators, principals, etc. And from these interviews is where we really get to derive a lot of the qualitative and anecdotal data that the hard data won't always illustrate. Also, it's been brought to our attention that some parents have attempted to sign up for the focus groups, but have been waitlisted in some cases. I just want to say that we as a team are aware, and we'd like to set up another slot of time for those parents who are on the waiting list, just so they have that time to speak, to have discussions with our team, because we highly value that input. In terms of student file review, this is where we'll be reviewing redacted student files and information. And through this records review, what we really want to achieve is that we'll be able to address a number of themes related to special education management, student identification, programs and services, curriculum and instruction and staffing, while simultaneously allowing us to address specific process questions about the development of IEPs, their implementation, and documentation. The third on the list, the virtual classroom observations, are essentially designed to collect qualitative information about the school building as a whole and individual classrooms. And it's focused on some key areas such as functions and elements of explicit instruction and specially designed instruction as well. Next slide, please. And so data collection continued. In regard to the electronic surveys, there will be two surveys, one for parents, families to fill out, and the other for school-based staff. And it's important, obviously, that we have these perspectives and that we have this data for review. In our experience, we found that surveys really help to reveal some important information and allow for a greater participation rate across various groups, sometimes more so than focus groups and interviews allow. And then also there will be peer district interviews conducted. Our team will be interviewing other similar high performing districts such as Greenwich, and the superintendent, as well as the steering committee will agree with our team, PCG, on the peer districts to be reviewed. And in terms of the data policy and practices review, this is where our team will be reviewing documentation, reports, and district-specific and publicly available data. Next slide, please. And now we have data collection mapping. As you can see, this is a very streamlined chart to illustrate the methods we'll be utilizing to collect data that are tied to the research questions that were formulated, as Dr. Miller was describing before, that were based on the RFP. For example, as you can see from the chart, we'll be using all 5 data collection methods to answer the first question regarding how the continuum of services are aligned with FAPE. For the second question regarding the budget cost drivers, we'll be using the 3 different data collection methods. Next slide, please. And as you can see, we'll be collecting data 5 ways for question number 3, which is the organization and allocation of human capital in the district, and 3 methods for question number 4, which addresses the extent to which instruction improves student outcomes. And again, we'll be using 5 methods for question 5 as to how the district supports unique learning needs through tiered support. And I just want to emphasize that it was important for us to display this because we wanted to show that the way we collect data is very intentional, strategic, and aligned with questions that are tied to the areas that were described in the RFP. So the data collection process is very much tailored to the district's unique needs. Next slide, please. So I think for this slide, we can all agree that since earlier this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that our lives have changed very dramatically. And that, of course, has had real significant effects on the way that students have been receiving instruction in the district. So during the focus groups and interviews, our team will be very intentionally ensuring we'll be asking participants to reflect on the instructional practices prior to the shift in virtual instruction, as well as acknowledging how that shift has impacted students with disabilities. Through this, our team wants to better understand the impact of COVID-19 and essentially how it's affected the district's ability to provide programs and services to students with disabilities with fidelity. Next slide, please. So during this time, again, the COVID-19 factor, we are very committed at PCG to working with the district with flexibility and compassion. The pandemic has certainly impacted school operations, and we want to make certain that we are reviewing this when we're speaking with stakeholders. So to reiterate from the previous slide, embedded in our data collection process, we will be reviewing special education practices prior to the pandemic, lessons learned from virtual instruction, and how programs and services are delivered presently. Now, with that said, because we framed this proposal around social distancing rules, the activities for this review, for example, the interviews and focus groups, will be done virtually. And now I'd like to move to the next slide and hand it over to my colleague Matthew, and he can go further into the program review phases.
Thank you, Anna. So after we have completed over the next few months, we're going to be conducting all of those data collection activities that Anna mentioned. And we're going to be pulling that all together between January and June in that time frame to develop the report. So within this this 4th phase right here, there's a few steps that we'll go through. We'll draft a preliminary report, which will be comprehensive in nature, and we'll go through a stakeholder review just to ensure that we got all the details right, and not necessarily changing any of the recommendations or outcomes, but just to go ahead and check that we have, we've gotten the information, some of the details and how the district operates, that's been reflected in the report. As well, we'll develop a executive summary that will accompany that report to be used for dissemination throughout the district. And then we'll go ahead and submit that final report. So this is really that stage in that phase of the project that there might not be a lot of activity going on during that time as we're heads down, we're evaluating all of those data collection pieces, we're analyzing that data, and we're pulling it all together to inform recommendations in that final report. Next slide, please. And that final phase on phase 5 is really where we cap out this project. And the emphasis in this is that we're reporting the findings to the school board, and we're providing these presentations to stakeholders as well. but we're also going to be supporting action planning and facilitating action planning sessions that help bring those recommendations that are listed and included in the report, to bring those into a roadmap where you can start to start the process of implementing change within the district. And the intent behind this phase is really that the report doesn't live on a shelf, but the recommendations are written and that report is written to really help guide planning over the next 3 to 5 years for the district, and to really help improve outcomes for students with disabilities in Greenwich. Next slide, please. So what's next? We're really excited to be leading this project and leading this work. And we, as Matt had mentioned, we have a tremendous amount of experience in this area and program reviews such as this nature, and to helping districts facilitate that action planning process to bring those recommendations to life and to inform strategic, both short-term planning and long-term planning as it relates to the offices of special education. And as reiterated throughout this presentation, PCG is really eager to engage in a partnership with GPS to ensure that this is a collaborative program review, and working with the steering committee that's been overseeing some of the work that we're doing as well, and making sure this is collaborative and engaging with a broad and diverse group of stakeholders to make sure their input and their experiences are reflected within the outcomes of the report. So with that, I believe, next slide, please, I will turn it over to my colleague Matt to walk through our frequently asked questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. First, we'll start with some frequently asked questions, and then we're going to get into some questions that are very specific to your community by your community members. So let's start with the basic FAQs that we frequently get when we're doing these reviews. Number one, are you coming to my school? The answer is yes, but it will be virtual. And we are working with the district to have a highly choreographed classroom observation and focus group and interview protocol. So although we physically aren't in the building, it will feel very much like we are in the building. So for the most part, we'll do our best in terms of trying to make sure we are getting a cross-selection of all the school buildings in the district. How many people will be included in the focus groups and interviews? You know, when we do the math, it's in the hundreds. It's a lot. We are looking at speaking to families, and that's one of the most important constituencies in terms of this, as well as the reason we do this work, supporting their students. We'll be talking to teachers. We'll be talking to administrators. We will be talking to a lot of people. We will be listening, we'll be learning, all the while making sure too that the information that's shared is confidential. Folks will not be called out in the report. We'll be taking great pains to make sure that we're listening, that we're bringing it back. We're using a qualitative analysis, best practices in qualitative analysis to code the information and then put the patterns, identify the patterns into the report. So that leads us to the next question. Will the focus groups and interviews be confidential? Yes, unless under the rare circumstances that there's some, you know, in terms of child abuse or neglect or something that we have to report, we will be maintaining confidentiality through the interviews and focus groups. And we'll ask the folks that are in the room to also keep what's said in the room to stay in the room. Will the final report be made public? The answer to that is yes. Will schools and individuals be named in the report? Under rare circumstances, will we name administrators, usually at central office? And if that's the case, we'll say, Dr. Jones, we really have an interesting quote that we would like to use. May we use it and cite you for it? Otherwise, we will not be naming people or buildings. And if we are going to name a building, under rare circumstances that we do, we would also make sure that is permitted. We wouldn't do that otherwise. And will the report improve positives in the areas of need, as well as areas that need improvement? Yes. You know, our job is to look at the commendable places that are happening, the commendable things that are happening in the district, as well as areas to improve. recommendations. And sometimes those recommendations may be going from good to great. And other times those recommendations may be going from one place to another place. Nevertheless, we will be including both in the report. Next, please. So now we're going to get into the community questions. And I must say, before I get into this, you know, it's always a pleasure, and I mean this, it's always a pleasure to work in a community that is so engaged as Greenwich is. And the fact that community members took the time to submit questions in advance, and this won't be the last opportunity to share or ask or learn. Nevertheless, we are always heartened by community support. So thank you very much for submitting these. And there will be other opportunities to share information, may it be through surveys, may it be through a confidential email address, which we'll be sharing in the future, may it be through focus groups and interviews. So what I'd like to do is read these questions verbatim and read the answers verbatim, just because I want to recognize the time and effort that folks put in to submit these. So is this review being conducted independently from the special education department? The answer is yes. This engagement is an independent, transparent, external review of GPS's special education program. Now, it's internally being led by a GPS steering committee, and that's comprised of the superintendent as well as parent and board representation. And we've had the pleasure already of meeting with members of the steering committee, and we're delighted that they, as well as the superintendent, are leading this work. The next question, will PCG review prior GPS special ed studies and key meetings on these studies? Yes, this is important background information. Now, we will be certain and we'll be sure that we won't use these reports to sway what it is we're looking at. Nevertheless, we will look at them and subsequently make really some notes as to where the district was and where the district is. And some of these key meetings and these key reports include the Gold Report in '97, the MGT report in 2005, the Oswego report in 2010, the DeFrancis report in 2014, the Key to Ed report, that was 2019-20, and then Board of Ed meetings that were in June 19, September 19, February 20, and the BET public hearing January 2020. That's a lot. Nevertheless, it's important that we review it and start to fully understand and process the purpose of the reviews as well as their findings. Next slide. Will PCG review GPS's referral practices, processes, and special education timelines? Yes. PCG will review documentation and dates of parent evaluation requests regarding timelines. We'll be looking at compliance with state and federal timelines. We'll be looking at RTI and its relationship to special ed referrals. We'll be looking at staff training as it relates to child find. We'll also be leveraging national data in the review of timelines. We'll be using the schools, the 5 schools that will be working with the committee as well as the Office of the Superintendent to agree on. We'll also be reviewing internally the consistency of special education standard operating practices, and that's across all schools and within the district. The next question, will PCG study the PPT processes and trainings that are occurring in the district? Yes, PCG will review the processes of what may be known as, quote, pre-PPT meetings and, quote, IEP boot camp. Furthermore, we'll be reviewing the trainings for special education administrators regarding how PPT meetings are conducted. We'll be reviewing trainings around IEP timelines, compliance, child find, parent communication, staff communication, the structure and timing of PPT meetings, and the scheduling of meetings. And I will say, in response to that question too, we're doing our best to be as inclusive of these things as possible. This is a long list of things we'll be looking at, and some of the things that are in these questions that may be scratching the surface. We may even be going deeper. So I don't want you to think that our study is limited to the responses we're providing, but I want to make sure we have an opportunity to answer the questions and comments submitted by the public. Next, please. Will PCG review special education settlements and out-of-district placements? Yes, we will review patterns in the rationale for out-of-district placements. We'll also review trends and practices around special education settlements. The next question, will PCG review special education staffing? Yes, we will review special education policies and procedures related to staffing. We'll examine the present management structure of the district special education department, the annual review process for special education staff and administrators, and other special education staff and administration accountability measures as well. Next slide, please. How will PCG be reviewing IEPs? So we'll be doing this over the course of 4 days. And this is actually something we worked with the superintendent and the steering committee on in terms of expanding the scope to make sure we have as much time as we can to do this in a very thorough manner. This student-centered file process will specifically examine student IEPs. These PCG facilitated focus groups will be comprised of PPT members and yield data on matters related to IEP creation and PPT-based practices throughout GPS. How will PCG be selecting the IEPs for its file review focus groups? So based on a review of the district's entire IEP student population, so we're going to be looking at the whole population, we're going to be looking at it broken down by disability category and by grade. And we will be making requests for redacted IEPs of a representative sampling of students with IEPs. And this, like I said, will be representative based on the district's composition of students with disabilities by disability category, grade, race, ethnicity, gender, twice exceptionality, and duly identified English learners. And GPS staff will not be selecting the IEPs for this review, and that they will have no part in saying Billy Smith and Johnny Doe. They will not be pulling the file as it relates to the name. They will be responding to PCG's request based on this process. How will PCG avoid conflicts of interest during the selection of sampled IEPs? So to avoid any potential conflicts of interest, the GPS Special Education Department will not be selecting or recommending the selection of any files for this review. PCG will be requesting specific IEPs by student ID number, and a person determined by the superintendent of schools will be accessing the requested files, and that will be Jennifer Lau. Next slide, please. How are high school special education teachers supposed to manage a caseload of 35+ students without any para support or any coverage for PPTs? And that is a community member question. Our answer to that is that the PCG will be studying the staffing of special education department, or the special ed department, including teachers, special ed teachers, and para educators, examining staff to student ratios. We certainly look forward to exploring this further during the review. And at this time, I certainly don't have a more concise answer, but we will be getting into the data, digging through it, and we look forward to assessing that in the report. Has anyone given thought to having the budget split, one for the normal operating expenses and a second for paying out when we lose a lawsuit? I'm concerned that the implications of paying out a lot of money for outsourced schooling due to litigious parents, does that not impact the delivery of services that could possibly prevent such lawsuits? How do we maintain the staff we need since the budget is so clearly impacted by outsourcing? So in terms of our review, and some of this may be redundant, we'll be reviewing the special education budget and we'll be offering recommendations. We'll be reviewing costs related to special education litigation. We are right now in the process of collecting data, of voluminous data requests from the district on this matter. And we look forward to studying this in greater detail and providing recommendations that may address this. We will also be reviewing out-of-district placements for student programs. And we addressed that in a prior area of this time, but I want to make sure that I make it clear here. Next slide, please. Hi, I am curious why you are not using teletherapy and or teleassessment to deliver speech language therapy, occupational therapy, and or behavioral and mental health services. Aside from expanding your own capacity and reducing your clinicians' caseloads, students respond favorably to the digital format of teletherapy, and both clinicians and students report that they are able to develop the same or closer relationships through a platform built for teletherapy versus a generic video conferencing platform such as Google or Zoom. Well, let me say this. PCG will be studying the ways that the district provides related services to students who receive them. So during this review, we'll be studying how the district does and how it does not deliver related services and the means of the provision of the services. And that includes teletherapy or teleassessment as well. The next question, will eligibility criteria be reviewed as well as assessments to determine eligibility, specifically for an SLD, as it is necessary for RTI? So let me say this in broad terms, we'll be reviewing the eligibility practices and protocols within the district. PCG will also be reviewing RTI practices and protocols, as well as its role in pre-referral for special education. Next slide, please. Will the study also consider challenges with 504 accommodations? If not, can you conduct a similar review of how 504 accommodations and other non-special education interventions are provided in GPS? PCG will be, to answer that, PCG will be studying 504 as it relates to the number of students who concurrently have an IEP and a 504, as well as students who had an IEP and now have a 504. This study, however, is not an in-depth review of 504 supports and services specifically. And the other piece of your question, other non-special education interventions, I think you may be referring to RTI, which, as we know, is for all students, not just limited to students with disabilities. We will be looking at RTI. The next question, is it within best practices for a district to make financial deals with families and in exchange have the families sign contracts that they will not hold the district liable for any wrongdoings? So PCG is going to be studying the practices and protocols of the district special ed department. Like I said earlier, we're presently conducting a document and data review that will be examining its operating practices to provide actionable recommendations for the district. So we'll be studying that in greater detail. And we will, in terms of what our findings are, you saw we've got quite a stable of experts on our panel who's studying this work with us, including one with a legal background. So we look forward to getting into such questions when we go through the report. The next one, there doesn't appear to be any program catering to the 2E cohort. I believe that's, in this instance, twice exceptional. They are lost in the system that is under-educating them because they don't learn in the traditional way. So we're going to be providing, studying the continuum of services offered to students with IEPs in the district, including services provided to twice exceptional students. Next slide, please. Is it fair that students with severe ADHD, which seems to be even worse during distance, be expected to maintain the same workload and deadlines given to students with the benefit of in-person learning? So we look forward to learning more about students engaged in distance learning, maybe hybrid or fully virtual. Although we cannot speak to this specific case, we will be conducting interviews and focus groups to further study teaching and learning for students with IEPs, and that includes students with IEPs in a variety of different learning environments. Next question, what schools are the gold standard benchmark that you will be comparing GPS to? The gold standard benchmark schools should be all school in the world, and this is verbatim, I'm quoting what the person wrote, all school, I believe they meant schools in the world, or at a minimum in the US, and should not be limited to just schools in Connecticut. So right now we're in the process of identifying local, regional, and national school districts for comparison, and we'll be working with the steering committee and the office of the superintendent in terms of approving those schools. Next slide, please. What obligations, and this is the last question that came in from the community when there was the opportunity to submit, what obligations do school staff have for identifying children with special needs? Parents often don't know what is, quote, special needs and what is just troublesome behavior. We were left out on our own for years before a family friend suggested our child might be autistic. He was, as diagnosed by several doctors. Since GPS won't agree. Until we have lawyered up, ignore, then deny, then fight, and we finally do what the law requires. That's how special education operates within GPS. Well, let me say that we will be reviewing the identification practices of GPS, including its understanding of and adherence to child find, which child find is within the Individuals with Disabilities Act as it relates to the district's obligation to identify and support children with disabilities. So that does it, I believe, for all of the questions and answers. Let's advance it to the next slide to be sure. Yep, I'm right. Okay. So that does it for the questions and answers. And for the folks who, are now thinking more like, oh, I've got a question. Oh, I want to share something. There will be many, many opportunities to do just that. And we sincerely look forward to engaging with you, the community, on this effort. So I'll give the microphone or a virtual microphone back to Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was excellent. Such a great overview, I think, for our community. And thank you for sharing so much about your backgrounds, because I think it's very evident that you're highly qualified in your field. I do just want to reiterate, this is on our board agenda tomorrow night, just as another discussion item. So, after they've heard this tonight, we could come back and be requesting another tweak. So I just want to share that. And also, I think you were very strong. I think it came across tonight. This is an independent review. I'm involved because somebody has to be at the district to help you get what you need, but we really know this is going to be your review. And we have the steering committee, which is again made up of two board members, Karen Hirsch and Karen Kowalski. We have our two parent, which are both representatives for PTA in special education, Caroline Laram. And then I didn't mention KDU before, but while we were on this call, they did send me the name. So I just want you to know, and she is the twice exceptional rep for PTA. So again, I want to thank you for tonight. And just as a reminder, this is recorded. So we will have it posted and out to the community for those who couldn't attend tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.